Moving on to other clean DOM tricks, an attribute selector on a component is a twist on the typical selectors you're probably used to, and available simply because underneath the Angular covers, components are just directives with a template and potentially a style sheet. Typically, you specify the selector like this in the component decorator. Use them like this in a template, and they produce the output like this in the DOM. No big deal and what we all use most of the time. I can think of a few scenarios where maybe this isn't what you need though. In any event, the appcomp2 element is just noise. It provides no value. Wouldn't it be nice if we could get rid of that extraneous element? As you would expect, the good news is that we can, easily. All we have to do is specify our selector inside square brackets, like this. Use it as an attribute on a standard element, and it results in a cleaner DOM, like this. There's no difference in the UI, so this isn't something that the user is going to see, but it's going to be easier for us to work with, either in debugging or in our initial development or in maintenance development. So you can see here on the screen in this attribute selector widget, I have two different child components presented. Well, the same child component presented twice. I'm using what I call the normal selector, and then for the attribute selector, it also says this is the child component. So let's open up the DevTools and take a look at what we have going on here. So starting, just to get our bearings, starting from the heading for our normal selector, inside that we have a div with a class of myClass, and inside that we have our element for our child component. Contrast that with what we have for the attribute selector. Here's the heading for the attribute selector. Inside that we have our div with a class of myClass, but that div is our child component now. We don't have a separate element for the child component. So a small piece, but if you're using this consistently, it's going to start to add up. And I don't think this is going to have any noticeable impact on the speed, but if you need to go through and be working inside the DOM to debug a problem, I find it a lot easier to have a cleaner DOM to work with. The fact that it's really easy to get this is also another selling point, so let's take a look at that. Inside our child component, the only change that we need to make is here. You'll notice on our selector for the component, we have the typical selector that we would use, but then we also have an attribute selector specified. Everything else is exactly the same. When I go and want to add that component in, I can do it one of two different ways. I can do it what I call the normal way and use the element selector, or I can add it just as an attribute onto another HTML element. So in this case, I'm using a div, and I just use that attribute selector to specify that I want to insert the child component there.